The day of my wedding looked perfect to anyone watching from the outside. The venue was full, the flowers were exactly how I had imagined, and everyone was smiling like nothing could possibly go wrong. But I remember the exact moment my chest tightened, even though I couldn't explain why. It happened during the speeches. My mother-in-law stood up from her seat with a confident smile, holding a white envelope in her hand. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for attention, it assumes it. She looked at my husband first. Then she glanced at me, just briefly, too fast to be affection. "I just want to make sure my son never struggles as he starts this new chapter of his life," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Some people nodded, others smiled approvingly. Then she handed the envelope to him. "This is a wedding gift, a little help, because starting out isn't easy." My husband thanked her, visibly emotional. People applauded. I smiled too. But in that moment, something became very clear to me. That money wasn't given to both of us. It was given to her son. And although no one knew it yet, that $10,000 check wasn't an act of love. It was a way of marking territory. What I didn't know was that 5 years later, she would be sitting in front of a judge, claiming that I had forced her to give it to us. If I'm honest, Lorraine never did anything dramatic the first time we met. That's what made it confusing. She hugged me when Caleb brought me to her house for dinner, but her arms stayed stiff, like she was holding a coat hanger instead of a person. Her smile didn't change when she looked at me. It was the same polite curve she gave the neighbors, the cashier, the woman who rang the doorbell to sell alarm systems. Friendly, distant, finished. She called me sweetheart before she learned my name. Dinner was quiet in the way that feels intentional. Lorraine asked Caleb about his job, his commute, his plans. When he spoke, she leaned in, nodding, fully present. When I added something, she listened just long enough to respond politely, then redirected the conversation back to him. "So what do you do, Nia?" she asked, finally, as she placed a bowl of salad on the table. "I'm a hair braider," I said. "I'm licensed. I work independently." She paused, just for a second, then smiled again. "Oh, that's creative." She said it the way people say "that's nice" when they don't mean it. I explained a little more because that's what you do when you sense misunderstanding. I told her about my clients, about the demand, about how far in advance I booked. I mentioned that I paid my own bills, that I liked the flexibility. She nodded, not impressed, not offended, just uninterested. "Well," she said, serving herself, "as long as Caleb is stable." It was subtle, clean, easy to miss, but I felt it. From the beginning, Lorraine treated me like a temporary detail in her son's life, something he was trying out, something she assumed would either change or fade with time. She wasn't cruel, she was careful. That's what made her dangerous. Over the next few months, I noticed patterns. She never asked me questions that required follow-up. She never remembered details about my work, even after I explained them more than once. She'd ask, "So are you still doing hair?" The same way someone asks if you're still into a hobby you'll outgrow. At first, I told myself I was being sensitive. That's what women like me learn to do early. We learn to doubt our instincts. We learn to explain other people's behavior before we name it. When Caleb and I got engaged, Lorraine hugged me again. Same stiffness, same smile. "I'm happy if you're happy," she said. It sounded supportive, but it wasn't the same as "I'm happy for you." The engagement dinner was hosted at her house. She invited family friends, people who had known Caleb since he was a kid. She told stories about him that made everyone laugh. She talked about his achievements, his degrees, his work ethic. When someone asked about me, she said, "Naya is very independent." Then she changed the subject. I didn't need her to praise me. I wasn't looking for approval, but there was something unsettling about being reduced to a vague adjective while everyone else got substance. Independent from what? From who? I noticed that Lorraine's generosity always had an audience. She paid for dinner loudly. She made sure people knew when she helped someone out. When she gave advice, it came wrapped in concern, but landed like instruction. She liked being needed, and she liked reminding people of it. Caleb didn't see it, or maybe he didn't want to. He'd say things like, "That's just how she is," or "She means well," or my least favorite, "You know she comes from a different generation." I came from a different generation too, one where women had learned to survive without asking permission, but I kept that to myself. The truth is, Lorraine never raised her voice at me, she never insulted me outright, she simply never fully acknowledged me as someone permanent, capable, or equal. When I talked about my business, she'd say, "That's good for now." When I mentioned long-term plans, she'd smile and say, "Life changes." When Caleb talked about our future, she'd say, "As long as you're taken care of." Never, "You both," always, "him." I started paying attention, not out of bitterness, but out of self-protection. I noticed how she framed things. I noticed what she emphasized and what she skipped. I noticed that her kindness had conditions, even if they weren't stated out loud. I also noticed something else. Lorraine underestimated me. She mistook my calm for passivity, my silence for agreement, my politeness for insecurity. She didn't see someone calculating or strategic. She saw someone she believed would never challenge her version of events. And she was right about one thing: I didn't challenge her. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. I believed, even then, that people eventually tell on themselves. All you have to do is give them time and space to feel comfortable. So I watched. I listened. I remembered. And when the wedding day came, and Lorraine stood up with that white envelope in her hand, smiling like a woman who had planned her moment carefully, I already knew something important. Whatever she was about to give us, it wasn't free. And whatever she thought she was buying, it wasn't obedience. It was silence. And I had always been very good at that. The morning of the wedding moved fast, like time was trying to stay out of the way. My friends helped me get ready in the small room behind the venue. There was laughter, music playing softly from someone's phone, the smell of hairspray and perfume layered over nerves. I remember looking at myself in the mirror and feeling steady. Not anxious, not doubtful, just present. I wasn't marrying into fantasy, I knew that. But I believed in the life Caleb and I were building. I believed in work and partnership, in choosing each other daily. The ceremony itself was beautiful, simple, honest. When I walked down the aisle, Caleb's face softened in a way that made everything else fade. For a moment, I forgot about family dynamics, about tension, about careful smiles. We said our vows, we kissed, people clapped, cameras flashed. From the outside, it was perfect. The reception followed in a blur of plates, music, and conversations that overlapped without ever quite finishing. I noticed Lorraine early on, moving through the room like she belonged to it. She spoke to guests I had never met as if she were the host, even though she wasn't paying for the venue. She looked pleased, centered, comfortable. When it was time for speeches, I felt my shoulders tighten without understanding why. The best man spoke, my maid of honor followed. Both were warm, genuine, full of shared memories. Then Lorraine stood up. She didn't rush. She adjusted her jacket, picked up her glass, and waited until the room naturally quieted. She didn't need to tap the microphone. People were already looking at her. "I won't take long," she said, smiling. "I just want to say how proud I am of my son." There it was, ran on time. She talked about Caleb as a child, as a student, as a man who had always worked hard. She talked about sacrifices she had made, about how difficult it is for young couples today. Her tone was sympathetic, almost generous. Then she lifted the white envelope. "I know starting out isn't easy," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "And I just want to make sure my son never struggles as he begins this new chapter of his life." Some people nodded, a few murmured approval. She turned toward Caleb and handed him the envelope with both hands like it was ceremonial. "This is a wedding gift, a little help, because sustaining everything on your own isn't simple." She laughed lightly as if it were a shared joke. Caleb looked stunned, emotional. He hugged her, thanked her, said something about how much it meant to us. Us. I smiled. I even clapped with everyone else. But something had shifted inside me, because Lorraine hadn't looked at me when she said it. Not once.
She didn't say you both. She didn't say your marriage. She didn't say your future together. She said, my son. And in that moment, I understood that the envelope wasn't symbolic. It was directional. The applause washed over us, but I felt oddly separate from it, like I was standing slightly outside my own wedding, watching a scene that would matter later. Afterward, people congratulated us and mentioned the gift. Lorraine stayed close, accepting praise with a modest tilt of her head. "It's just what family does," she said more than once. Family. I caught her eye once, briefly. She smiled at me then, soft, measured, the kind of smile that says, "Remember this." That night, after the guests left and the music faded, Caleb and I sat on the edge of the bed in our hotel room and opened the envelope. The check was for $10,000. No note, no conditions, no mention of repayment. Caleb was overwhelmed. He kept shaking his head, saying he didn't expect it, saying his mother had surprised him. I nodded. I said it was generous, because on paper it was, but I didn't feel grateful. I felt marked. I felt like a line had been drawn, quietly, publicly, and with witnesses, like something had been given in a way that could always be taken back, or at least used. I didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the time, and honestly, I didn't need to. I already knew something important. That check wasn't meant to support a marriage. It was meant to reinforce a hierarchy. And whether Lorraine realized it or not, she had just made a mistake. Because gifts given in public don't disappear in private. They leave echoes, and I had always been very good at listening for them. The first year after our wedding was ordinary in the way real life is ordinary. We went back to work, we paid bills, we argued about small things like who forgot to buy paper towels and whose turn it was to call the landlord. We learned each other in the quiet spaces where romance doesn't perform. And that $10,000 check sat in our joint account like a polite guest. We used it carefully, not because Lorraine asked us to, but because I didn't want to give her a reason to say we were reckless. Caleb wanted to use some of it for a new car right away. I suggested we hold it for emergencies and put a portion toward our credit card balance. He agreed, mostly because I said it calmly and made it make sense. That was my role in our marriage from the beginning. Not loud, not controlling, just steady. If Lorraine had ever said the word loan, I would have remembered it. If she had ever asked for repayment, there would have been a text, an email, a conversation Caleb could point to. Something. There was nothing. No repayment plan, no interest, no timeline, no hint that the gift came with an invisible contract. For months, I waited for it to come up, not because I felt guilty, but because I understood Lorraine. I understood people who use generosity like a leash. But she didn't mention it right away. She let time pass. She let comfort settle in. She let us believe it was done and over. Then, slowly, she started bringing it up in the places where it would sting the most.
Not in private, where you can clarify, in public, where you have to choose between dignity and disruption. It began with little comments at family dinners. Lorraine would pour wine or pass a plate and say, almost casually, "I'm glad I could help you two get on your feet." Or, "That first year is so expensive. I remember how tight things were for you." Tight, like we had been desperate, like we had been one bill away from falling apart. The first time she said it, I froze for half a second. Caleb didn't. He just smiled and said, "Yeah, we appreciated it." And Lorraine would smile back, satisfied. Sometimes she'd glance at me afterward as if to check whether I understood my place in the story she was telling. I did. I just didn't acknowledge it. The second year, the comments sharpened. We were at a birthday dinner for Caleb's cousin, sitting at a long table with people I barely knew. Someone asked how work was going. Caleb talked about his job. Then someone turned to me. "What about you, Naya?" they asked. "What do you do?" I answered the way I always did. I explained my business. I said I had regular clients, that I was booked most weekends, that I was building a strong base. Before I could finish, Lorraine laughed softly. "Oh, she does braids," she said. "She's always been creative." The word landed the same way it had the first time we met. Then she added, "It's nice, of course, but it's not exactly stable in the way a career is." The table went quiet for a moment, the way it does when someone says something rude in a tone that dares you to call it rude. I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because I knew exactly what Lorraine wanted. She wanted me to defend myself. She wanted me to justify my work. She wanted me to look emotional in front of her family so she could label me what she had been labeling me silently all along: sensitive, defensive, insecure. So I took a sip of water and said, "It's been stable for me." That was it. Lorraine's smile tightened just slightly, like she hadn't gotten the reaction she ordered. After that, she started using the check in the same breath as my work. It wasn't always direct. Lorraine didn't do direct, she did implication. She'd say things like, "Well, thank goodness Caleb has a good job. Starting out was tough enough, even with help." Or, "Marriage is expensive, especially when one person is carrying most of it." She never said my name when she did it, but everyone knew who she meant. The third year, Caleb and I bought a small house. Nothing flashy, a modest place with a little backyard. I used one room as a studio space, set up a chair, a mirror, shelves with hair products arranged neatly like a boutique. I painted the walls myself on a Sunday morning while Caleb watched football in the living room. It was mine. The day Lorraine came to see it, she walked through the house like an inspector. She complimented the kitchen, she commented on the neighborhood. Then she stood in my studio doorway and looked around. "Is this where you do your little hair thing?" she asked. Little. I kept my voice calm. "This is where I work." She stepped inside, ran her fingers along a shelf, and said, "Well, it's good to have hobbies." Caleb laughed awkwardly, like he wasn't sure whether to correct her. He didn't. He just shifted his weight and said, "Mom, Nia does really well." Lorraine turned toward him, smile back in place. "I'm sure she does," she said. "I just mean it's not like a guaranteed paycheck." Then she glanced at me like she expected me to argue. I didn't. That night, after she left, Caleb apologized in the way people do when they don't want to dig deeper. "She didn't mean it like that," he said. I looked at him, calm, tired. "How did she mean it?" I asked. He didn't have an answer. I let it go, not because it didn't matter, but because I was collecting something more valuable than a moment of being right. I was collecting patterns. In year 4, my business grew. I raised my prices, I got consistent referrals,
I started requiring deposits to hold appointments. My clients respected me, they listened to my policies, they showed up on time because I did. I built something real with my hands, the same hands Lorraine considered unserious. I also started saving more aggressively. I opened a separate account for my business taxes and another for long-term goals. I paid off the last of my personal credit card debt. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't need applause. But I noticed something. The more independent I became, the more Lorraine's comments shifted from dismissive to uneasy. It wasn't just that she didn't respect my work. It was that my work proved I couldn't be controlled through shame. And Lorraine didn't know what to do with a woman who couldn't be made small. By year 5, her mentions of the check felt less like bragging and more like reminders, like she needed the family to remember that she had once positioned herself as our rescuer. At Thanksgiving, she lifted her glass and said, "It's good to see you two doing better now. Back then you were so tight. I didn't know what would have happened if I hadn't stepped in." People chuckled. Someone said, "Lorraine always comes through." I watched her face as they praised her. She looked relieved, like the attention was oxygen. Caleb squeezed my hand under the table. Maybe he sensed my tension. Maybe he was beginning to. Later that night, while I washed dishes in the kitchen, I heard Lorraine speaking in the living room. She was telling someone, "Caleb was under so much pressure those first years. It's hard when you're sustaining everything. Everyone contributes how they can, but—" Her voice faded, followed by a soft laugh. I dried my hands slowly and stared at the towel. That was when something settled in me, heavy and clear. Lorraine didn't see our marriage as a partnership. She saw it as her son's life with me attached. And the check wasn't a gift she gave to celebrate love. It was a story she told to keep herself important. A reminder that she could insert herself whenever she wanted. And still, in 5 years, she never once asked for repayment, not even once. Because she wasn't waiting to be paid back with money, she was waiting to be paid back with obedience. What she didn't know was that every time she brought it up, every time she used it to embarrass me, every time she tried to rewrite our roles in front of other people, she was giving me something too. A record, a trail, a public history.
And I was patient enough to let her build it. The gathering that finally broke whatever illusion of peace I still had wasn't a holiday. That would have made it easier to explain. It was a summer barbecue at Lorraine's sister's house, the kind of event where people drift in and out all afternoon, plates balanced on paper napkins, conversations overlapping in half-finished sentences, extended family, old friends, people who knew Caleb as a boy but knew me only as his wife. The weather was heavy, humid in that Atlanta way that makes everything feel slower and louder at the same time. I wore a simple sundress and sandals, nothing that asked for attention. I had braided my hair the night before, neat and clean, the way my clients liked it. I noticed Lorraine as soon as we arrived. She was already positioned near the center of the yard, laughing, holding court. When she saw us, she smiled wide and waved Caleb over like he was still 10 years old. "Naya," she said when we got closer, leaning in for a quick side hug, "you made it." Not, "I'm glad you're here," just, "you made it." I handed over the dish I brought, greeted a few relatives, and tried to settle into the background. I'd learned that at events like this, visibility came with a cost. For the first hour, things stayed neutral. People asked how we were, Caleb talked about work, someone asked if we liked the house, Lorraine hovered nearby, listening, occasionally adding commentary. Then someone, an aunt I barely knew, asked, "So Naya, are you still doing hair?" The question wasn't rude on its own. It was the way Lorraine leaned in that made my stomach tighten. "Yes," I said, "I stay pretty busy." Before I could add anything else, Lorraine laughed softly. "Well, she's always been good with her hands," she said. "She's very talented." Talented. Another word that sounded like a compliment but landed like a ceiling. I smiled politely. "It keeps me busy." Lorraine tilted her head. "Of course, but it's not exactly the same as a steady career, is it?" There it was. The conversation slowed. People glanced at each other, then back at me. I could feel that familiar pressure building in my chest, the choice between swallowing it or pushing back. I chose neither. "It's steady for me," I said again. Lorraine chuckled, shaking her head lightly. "You've always been very sensitive about this subject." "Sensitive," she said, with a smile like she was smoothing things over. I felt something sharp and cold settle behind my ribs. Before I could respond, she continued, louder now, projecting for the group. "I just worry sometimes. Starting out was so hard for them. They were so tight financially back then." I hadn't heard her use that word in a while. Tight. She looked around the group as if inviting agreement. "You know how it is when one person is carrying most of the load." I saw it then, clearly. The setup, the implication. Caleb shifted beside me. I could feel his discomfort, but he didn't interrupt. Years of conditioning don't disappear in a moment. Someone laughed awkwardly. Another person nodded. Lorraine smiled, encouraged. "That's why we helped when we did. I couldn't just watch my son struggle." The check. She hadn't said the amount. She didn't need to. Everyone in the family had heard that story by now. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my voice even. "We weren't struggling," I said. The words landed quietly, but they landed. Lorraine turned to me, eyebrows raised in gentle surprise. "Oh, Naya," she said, "you remember things differently." There it was. Gaslighting wrapped in sweetness. "You've always been very emotional about money," she added. "I think you took things more personally than they were meant." I stared at her for a moment, really looked at her. The relaxed posture, the calm smile, the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. "I'm not emotional. I'm factual." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. Lorraine laughed again, louder this time. "See, this is what I mean. You're so quick to take offense." She turned back to the group. "I never meant it as criticism. I've always admired how creative she is. Everyone contributes in their own way. Everyone contributes how they can." She had used that phrase before. And suddenly, something in me snapped, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because she wasn't just talking about money. She was erasing my labor, publicly, casually, as if it were a favor to be acknowledged at her discretion. One of the cousins tried to change the subject, but Lorraine wasn't finished. She had an audience, and she was enjoying herself. "I just think it's important to be realistic," she said. "Hair is nice, but it's not something you build a future on. Not the kind of future Caleb has." That one hurt. Not because I believed it, I didn't, but because of where she chose to say it. In front of people who would remember. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my income or list my accomplishments. I didn't explain my business model or my plans. Instead, I said, "My work pays our mortgage." The silence was immediate. Lorraine blinked just once. I could tell she hadn't expected that. Facts disrupted her narrative. "Well," she said after a moment, smiling again. "That's good. I just meant back then things were different." Back then. Always back then. I realized then that she needed that version of the past to survive. the version where her money had been necessary, where my presence had been optional. Caleb finally spoke up, his voice tight. "Mom, that's not fair." Lorraine turned to him, concern sliding easily into place. "I'm not criticizing, sweetheart. I'm just being honest." Honest. Another word she used like armor. She looked at me again. "You know I've always wanted the best for you both. You shouldn't be so defensive." Defensive. Sensitive. Emotional. I nodded slowly. "I'm not defensive, I just don't like being misrepresented." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Naya, you always take things so personally." That was it.
I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't storm off. I excused myself, went inside, and stood in the bathroom for a moment with the door locked. I pressed my palms against the counter and breathed until my heart slowed. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had been patient for a long time. And patience, I was learning, has a limit. When I went back outside, Lorraine was laughing again, telling someone how hard the early years had been, how proud she was of Caleb for holding everything together. I didn't correct her. I didn't need to, because something had shifted permanently. I understood now that this wasn't misunderstanding or generational difference or awkwardness. It was strategy, and Lorraine had just played her hand in public. What she didn't realize was that everyone there had heard her, and one day she would need them to remember exactly what she said. Every word. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic day, not a meaningful date, just an ordinary afternoon when I had just finished braiding a client's hair and was sweeping up the floor of my studio. I remember because my back hurt, and I was thinking about what to cook for dinner. Caleb brought the mail in and left it on the counter like he always did. Bills, a flyer, a thick, unfamiliar envelope with our names typed neatly on the front. No return address I recognized. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Official. Intentional. I opened it slowly. The words didn't make sense at first. They sat on the page like they belonged to another story, another family. Notice of legal action. Claim of undue influence and emotional coercion. Demand for repayment. I read it again. Then a third time. My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. What I felt was something colder than fear. Recognition. Caleb noticed my silence and looked up from his phone. "What is it?" I handed him the papers without a word. He read them standing there, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief to something closer to panic. "This can't be right," he said. "This has to be a mistake." I watched him carefully. This moment mattered more than he understood. The filing named me, not us. Me. It claimed that Lorraine had been emotionally pressured into giving us money during a vulnerable period, that she had felt obligated to support her son because of my influence, that I had created an environment where she feared he would suffer if she didn't step in. The language was clean, legal, carefully written to sound reasonable. I felt something settle in my stomach. She wasn't just rewriting the past, she was erasing herself from it. Caleb kept reading, his breathing uneven. "She says it was a loan," he said. "She never said that," he replied quickly, like he was arguing with the paper itself. "She never asked for anything back." "I know," I said. We sat at the table in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. "Why now?" he asked. "Why would she do this now?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was uncomfortable. because it would force him to see something he had spent his entire life avoiding. "She's losing control," I said finally. He looked at me. "What?" "She's losing control over you," I said, "and she's scared." He shook his head. "That's not fair. She's under a lot of stress. She's been having money issues, you know that." There it was, the reflex. Protect, excuse, rationalize. I nodded. "I know she's having money issues." "So maybe she just panicked," he continued. "Maybe she felt taken advantage of and didn't know how to say it." I met his eyes. "For 5 years?" He didn't answer. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and messages. Lorraine didn't call me. She didn't text. She didn't explain. She went straight to an attorney. Family members started reaching out, cautiously at first, confused, concerned. "Is everything okay? What's going on with your mom? I heard something about a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That's what she was calling it. Caleb spoke to her before I did. He came back from that call looking drained, his shoulders slumped. "She says you pressured her," he said quietly. "She says you made her feel like she had to help or she'd lose me." I let the words hang in the air. "She said I did that?" I asked. He nodded. "She says you were emotional, that you talked about money all the time, that you made things sound worse than they were." I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "When have I ever talked about money with your mother?" I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "She says she felt manipulated, that she didn't feel like she had a choice." I leaned back in my chair. 5 years of public speeches, 5 years of reminders, 5 years of pride, and now she was claiming fear. Caleb looked torn, like someone standing between two versions of reality. "I don't think she's lying," he said carefully. "I think she genuinely believes this." "That doesn't make it true," I said. He sighed. "She's my mother." "I'm your wife," I replied. Not angry, just clear. That was the first time he really looked at me since the papers arrived. The lawsuit did something the years of subtle disrespect never had. It forced everything into the open. Caleb started replaying moments in his head. The wedding speech, the comments, the reminders. He asked questions he had never asked before. "She really never mentioned repayment? She said those things in front of people? She talked about you like that?" I answered calmly, honestly, without embellishment, and I watched something shift in him. Not fully, not yet, but enough to crack the surface. What hurt the most wasn't the lawsuit itself, it was the intention behind it. Lorraine wasn't just asking for money, she was asking the court to declare that I was the problem, that I had influenced, manipulated, coerced, that my presence in her son's life was something she had been forced to finance against her will. It was a character assassination wrapped in legal language, and for the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about debt. It was about punishment. She wanted to remind me of my place. She wanted to strip me of credibility, dignity, and voice, and she believed I wouldn't fight back. Because she had mistaken my silence for weakness. She had forgotten something important. I had never been quiet because I was afraid. I had been quiet because I was paying attention. And now she had finally given me a reason to speak. After the shock wore off, something else took its place. Focus. I didn't call Lorraine. I didn't send a message asking how she could do this. I didn't explain myself to anyone who hadn't asked directly. Emotion had no role to play here. Facts did. I contacted an attorney recommended by a client of mine, someone who had watched me work for years and knew I didn't scare easily. The consultation was calm, methodical. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the timeline. 5 years, a public wedding gift, no repayment request, repeated public references framed as generosity, not debt. He nodded slowly. "Do you have proof?" he asked. I did. I just hadn't called it proof until now. That night, I opened old folders on my laptop and scrolled through years of messages. I found texts from Lorraine congratulating Caleb after the wedding, messages that said things like, "We were happy to help," and "That's what family does." No mention of loans, no hint of obligation. I took screenshots, dated them, saved them twice. I went through my phone next. Photos from the wedding reception, Lorraine holding the microphone, the white envelope visible in her hand, guests seated, watching, smiling, public, intentional. I wrote down the names of people who had been there, family members, friends, even venue staff who remembered the moment because it had stood out. Then I moved on to my records. Bank statements showing when the check was deposited, no withdrawals to her, no payments back, no notes labeled loan or repayment. I printed everything, organized it by date. I created a timeline that showed something simple and undeniable. If someone gives you money publicly, calls it a gift, never asks for repayment, and repeatedly references it as generosity for 5 years, it isn't a loan. It's leverage. Caleb watched all of this quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. Occasionally, he'd ask a question, his voice low. "You really kept all this?" "Yes," I said. He shook his head slightly. "I didn't even think to." "That's because you never needed to," I replied. The hardest part wasn't gathering documents. It was resisting the urge to confront her. There were moments late at night when I wanted to send a message, to ask her how she planned to explain her wedding speech, to ask whether she remembered saying, "This is a gift." I didn't, because confrontation would give her something she didn't deserve: time. I let the attorney do the communicating. I let the paperwork speak. By the end of the week, I had a file thicker than the lawsuit itself: messages, photos, statements, a list of witnesses willing to testify to what they heard and saw. Caleb read through it one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, silent for a long time. "I didn't see it," he said finally. "I know," I replied. He looked up at me then, really looked. "I'm sorry." I nodded. Not forgiving, not punishing. Just acknowledging the moment. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about correcting the record. And I was ready. Not loudly, not emotionally, just completely. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No drama, no grand architecture, just beige walls, wooden benches, and quiet that felt heavier than noise. The kind of quiet where every breath sounds like a statement. Lorraine sat across the aisle from us, dressed carefully. Neutral colors, hair styled just enough to look composed but not extravagant. She didn't look at me when we entered. She kept her eyes forward, hands folded, posture practiced. She looked like a woman who expected to be believed. Caleb sat beside me, stiff, jaw tight. He hadn't slept much the night before. Neither had I. But while his exhaustion came from stress, mine came from preparation. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When Lorraine took the stand, she spoke confidently, calm, almost warm. She talked about being a concerned mother, about a difficult time in her son's life, about feeling pressure she didn't know how to name back then. "I felt emotionally obligated," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't want my son to suffer." The judge nodded, expression neutral. Lorraine continued. She explained that she hadn't intended the money as a loan, that she believed it was understood to be temporary help, that she felt uncomfortable asking for repayment because of the emotional dynamics involved. "And what were those dynamics?" the judge asked. Lorraine glanced at me for the first time, just briefly. "I felt influenced," she said. "There was a lot of discussion about finances.
A lot of stress. I felt like if I didn't help, I would lose my relationship with my son. I sat still. The words were familiar now, rehearsed, clean. The judge leaned back slightly. Did you put this understanding in writing? No, Lorraine said. We were family. Did you request repayment in the 5 years following the transfer? No, she admitted, but that doesn't mean... The judge raised her hand gently. I'll ask the questions. Lorraine nodded, lips pressed together. Did you refer to the money as a loan at any point during those 5 years? Lorraine hesitated, just a fraction of a second. I don't recall using that exact word, she said carefully. The judge made a note. Then Lorraine's attorney tried to reframe it, talked about emotional context, power dynamics, implied manipulation without ever stating it outright. The judge listened. Then it was my attorney's turn. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and began simply. Mrs. Brooks, he said to Lorraine, were witnesses present when you gave the check? Yes, she said. It was at the wedding. And did you speak publicly at that time? Yes. Did you refer to the check as a loan during that speech? No. What did you call it? Lorraine shifted in her seat. A gift. The word hung in the air. My attorney nodded. Thank you. He moved on to the evidence. Photos appeared on a screen. Lorraine at the microphone, the envelope visible, guests watching, smiling. Then messages, texts from Lorraine after the wedding. We were happy to help. That's what family does.
So glad we could support you. No mention of repayment, no expectation set. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Brooks, she said, can you explain why, if this was a loan, there is no documentation, no request for repayment, and repeated references to the money as a gift? Lorraine opened her mouth, closed it. I didn't feel comfortable bringing it up, she said finally. For 5 years? The judge asked. Lorraine's confidence faltered. I didn't want to cause conflict. The judge nodded slowly. Yet you are now pursuing legal action. Yes, Lorraine said, her voice thinner now, because I felt taken advantage of. My attorney stood again. Mrs. Brooks, he said, were you under financial distress at the time you gave the money? No. Did anyone threaten you? No. Did anyone promise repayment? No. Did anyone prevent you from requesting repayment later? No. Silence filled the room. The judge looked at Lorraine for a long moment, not unkindly, just clearly. Then she turned to me. Mrs. Brooks, she said, you may speak. I stood, slowly. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I never asked Lorraine for money. I never pressured her. I never discussed repayment because it was presented publicly as a gift. For 5 years, she referenced it as generosity, often in front of other people. I paused. I didn't object at the time because I believed she was proud of helping. I didn't know it would later be used against me. The judge nodded. Did you ever believe you owed her money? No, I said, but I always knew she believed I owed her something. Lorraine stiffened. The judge looked back at her. This court is not concerned with emotional discomfort after the fact. It is concerned with evidence. She glanced down at her notes. There is no proof of coercion, no documentation of a loan, no attempt to collect repayment for 5 years. The evidence supports the conclusion that this was a gift.
Lorraine's face drained of color. The judge continued, "This case is dismissed." Just like that. No gavel slam, no dramatic pause. Dismissed. Lorraine stared forward, unmoving. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something. She didn't respond. Caleb exhaled slowly beside me, like he had been holding his breath for years. As we stood to leave, Lorraine finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't angry. It was empty. The kind of emptiness that comes when a story you've relied on collapses in front of witnesses. She had come to court to reclaim control. Instead, she had lost the last place where her version of events could survive. And I hadn't raised my voice once. The dismissal didn't echo the way Lorraine had expected it to. There was no apology owed to her. No quiet corner where she could reframe the outcome as a misunderstanding. The words were clear, the record was set, and people noticed. Word traveled faster than I anticipated, not because I spread it, I didn't, but because Lorraine had built her reputation on being involved, generous, indispensable. When that image cracked, everyone felt it. Family members who had once nodded along to her stories started asking questions, not out loud, not directly to her, but among themselves. The same people who praised her help now remembered the wedding speech, the envelope, the applause. They remembered that it had been called a gift. Lorraine stopped hosting gatherings after that. Not formally, she just withdrew. Invitations slowed, then stopped altogether. When events did happen, she arrived late and left early. The woman who once held court now hovered at the edges. The shift was subtle but complete. People no longer deferred to her opinions the way they used to. When she offered advice, it landed softer, thinner. Without the weight of unquestioned authority, her words were just words. Caleb noticed it too. He started receiving fewer calls from her. When she did call, the conversations were shorter, more cautious, less commanding. She had lost something she couldn't get back. Not money. Narrative. At one family dinner, months later, someone mentioned the wedding in passing. Lorraine stiffened. No one looked at her. Another time, a cousin asked me about my work. Genuinely, asked how business was going, how long I'd been doing it, whether I liked being my own boss. Lorraine sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't interrupt. That was new. The greatest consequence wasn't public embarrassment, it was invisibility. Lorraine had always relied on being central, being needed, being the person who stepped in when others hesitated. The lawsuit had revealed that help could come with conditions, and once people see that, they never unsee it. Her authority dissolved. Not dramatically, just completely. Caleb and I didn't discuss it much. There was nothing left to argue. The facts had spoken, and they had done so in a room where emotion didn't matter. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our house, Caleb said quietly, "I never thought she'd do something like that." I looked at the street, the neighbors walking their dogs, life moving on. "She's always done things like that," I said. "She just never called it what it was before." He nodded. "I see it now." That mattered, not because I needed validation, but because it meant the cycle had finally broken. Lorraine didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. People like her rarely do. Apologies require acknowledging intent, and she still believed hers had been pure. But belief doesn't outweigh consequence. The family adjusted. Boundaries settled into place without discussion. Lorraine no longer set the tone, and for the first time since I had known her, she had no leverage left to use. Not money, not guilt, not history. She had tried to control the ending. Instead, she lost the ability to narrate the story at all.
And that, more than anything, was her fall. The dismissal didn't echo the way Lorraine had expected it to. There was no apology owed to her, no quiet corner where she could reframe the outcome as a misunderstanding. The judge's words were clear. The record was set. And once something like that is said out loud in a room where truth matters, it doesn't disappear. People noticed.
Not because I talked about it. I didn't. But Lorraine had spent years positioning herself as generous, dependable, essential. When that image cracked, it didn't shatter loudly. It thinned. And everyone felt it. Family members who had once nodded along to her stories began remembering details they'd ignored before. The wedding, the microphone, the white envelope, the way she'd called it a gift in front of a room full of witnesses. Those memories resurfaced without anyone needing to point them out. Lorraine stopped hosting gatherings after that. She didn't announce it, she simply withdrew. Invitations slowed, calls went unanswered. When family events did happen, she arrived late and left early. The woman who used to command the center of every room now lingered near the edges, her presence quieter than it had ever been. Her authority had dissolved. People no longer paused when she spoke. They didn't look to her for confirmation or approval. Advice that once landed with weight now floated, unanchored, easy to ignore. Caleb noticed the change before I did. "She doesn't talk the same anymore," he said one evening. "It's like she's careful now." Careful. That word stayed with me, because Lorraine had never been careful with me before. At a family dinner months later, someone asked about my work, not politely, not dismissively, with real interest. How long I'd been doing it, whether I enjoyed working for myself, whether it was hard to manage my own schedule. I answered, calmly, confidently. Lorraine sat across the table, hands folded, silent. She didn't interrupt, she didn't correct, she didn't diminish. That silence spoke louder than any insult she'd ever delivered. The greatest consequence wasn't embarrassment, it was irrelevance. Lorraine had always relied on being needed, on being the person who stepped in, who rescued, who reminded everyone of her importance. The lawsuit had exposed something she couldn't undo, that her generosity came with conditions, and once people see that, they never fully trust it again. She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. Apologies require accountability, and accountability was never her strength. What mattered was this: she no longer controlled the narrative. The family adjusted without ceremony. Boundaries settled naturally. Lorraine's opinions no longer set the tone. Her money no longer carried moral weight. Her version of the past no longer went unchallenged. She had tried to reclaim power through the courts. Instead, she lost the only power she'd really had, the ability to define reality for everyone else. And that loss was permanent. After everything settled, what surprised me most was how quiet my life became. Not empty, not lonely, peaceful. There were no more tense dinners where I measured my words, no more subtle comments waiting to land, no more stories about my marriage told by someone who wasn't in it. The silence felt earned. Caleb and I talked differently after that, not just about his mother, but about us, about loyalty, about what partnership actually means when pressure shows up as concern. He listened more. I spoke less carefully. Boundaries stopped feeling like something I had to defend. They just existed. Lorraine remained in our lives, but at a distance she hadn't chosen and couldn't negotiate. Conversations stayed surface level. Visits were shorter. Expectations were gone. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. Not my work, not my worth, not my role in my own marriage. I kept braiding hair. I kept building my business. I kept depositing checks into an account that belonged to me and no one else. The same hands that had been dismissed as a hobby had carried me through every season of my life. I understood something clearly now. The money was never the issue. It never had been. What Lorraine wanted wasn't repayment. It was relevance, control, a permanent claim over a life that wasn't hers to manage. And when that control disappeared, so did the conflict. There was no dramatic revenge, no victory speech, no moment where I needed to raise my voice. Justice arrived quietly, in documents, in memory, in truth spoken plainly. I didn't win by taking anything from her. I won by refusing to give her anything else. Not my silence, not my dignity, not my story. And finally, I lived in a life where none of that was up for negotiation. Before you go, thank you for watching and staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, please click the subscribe button and let me know what you thought. I'd really love to hear your experiences or opinions in the comments, especially if you've dealt with family boundaries or situations like this. And if you want more real, thoughtful stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. I truly appreciate you being here.